Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. India can become an upper middle income country by 2047 if it manages to achieve a sustained growth rate of 7 to 7.5% for the next 25 years. And at this growth rate, India can become a $20 trillion economy by 2047. Well, this was asserted by the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Dr. Bibek Debroy, while releasing the Competitiveness Roadmap for India at 100. With a GDP of $2.7 trillion, India is currently the world's sixth largest economy and is classified as a developing nation. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has set an ambitious target of making India a developed nation by 2047. A developed country is typically characterized by a relatively high level of economic growth, a general standard of living and higher per capita income, as well as performing well on the Human Development Index, which includes education, literacy, and health. So what will it take India to achieve the status of a developed nation? What should be the roadmap for the country for the next 25 years? That and much more in perspective today with an illustrious panel of experts joining me on the program. So let me first introduce them to you. Pleased to welcome Dr. Amit Kapoor, Honorary Chairman, Institute for Competitiveness, which in collaboration with the EASCPM has developed the roadmap for India at 100. Dr. Kapoor, thank you for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. Professor Charan Singh, he is CEO, eGrow Foundation, and Ms. Rajani Sinha, Chief Economist, CareEdge Group. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today. Dr. Kapoor, let's begin the program today with you. Give us and our viewers a sense of what is the competitiveness roadmap for India at 100 based on, and most importantly, what does it envision?
So this is a very important question that was posed to us a couple of years back in terms of like how India can actually be a developed nation. What is it that India needs to do? So we started looking at this whole set of data that India is, and we started looking at the historical antecedents of what India is all about. And we saw that there are 3 or 4 key challenges that India faces. One is, of course, the shared prosperity challenge, like how do we actually have growth which is equitable? The second was the jobs challenge. How do we create jobs over a period of time? And third was very important, and that's the implementation challenge. If you really see that India does have a certain level of implementation deficit, so how do we overcome that? And then fourth, and last not but the least, is actually about the global challenges that we are facing, and especially the headwinds. And the last 3 or 4 years have been very, very important in the world in terms of the COVID thing that has happened, the way the whole crisis or Ukraine-Russia crisis has panned out. So having looked at this, we said, what is it that India needs to do? So what could be the new set of goals that India needs to look at? What are the new developmental principles that we need to follow? What could be the policy priorities that we need to look at? And what should be the implementation model? So we said that there is going to be a 4S principle that India needs to actually follow, or that is what we need to imbibe in our thinking. And that 4S framework is that we need to have shared prosperity that needs to happen. That is economic opportunities that are shared across Indian society. The second thing is social development, or what you call as the economic growth that is matched with social progress. So because this is what the Prime Minister has also been saying, that ease of living is one of the most important factors that India needs to look at. The third was solid, in terms of like, how are we resilient to shocks? India has shown a lot of resilience in the last few years, especially with the external shocks that we are facing. But now the question is that how do we actually put it within the system that we become far more resilient towards these shocks? And last but not the least is about sustainability. So how do we actually create economic activities which are sustainable? So the 4S framework was social, shared, sustainable, and solid. So that is the framework that we are actually looking at. And this helps us in really envisaging that what needs to be done. What is it that is going to drive the national value proposition for the country? And when you really talk about the national value proposition, I think there are 3 or 4 things that emerge from here. One is, of course, demographics that will drive our growth. India certainly is having a huge demographic opportunity, and that opportunity would be with us until about 2055. So how do we develop that? How do we really focus on developing the demographic dividend that we actually see or foresee in the next few years? Of course, there are going to be spatial differences. When you talk about spatial differences, that states would differ, because there would be certain states which will age much earlier than certain other states. Kerala would age faster than UP and Bihar. So there would be spatial differences that occur. So how do states need to react? The second thing is like, how do we look at our existing strengths? India has amazing level of strengths that actually exist. We have tried to extract some of those strengths or work on those strengths, like the PLI schemes. But there is far more that we can do. Something like the pharmaceutical industry, the renewable energy industry, and so on and so forth. So that is what we really need to look at. But I'll not take much more time, but four very big points that how can we actually create sector specific growth strategies, or how do we enable social policies? How do we strengthen our markets? And how do we actually develop something what you would call as competitive firms is the focus that we are really saying. But to really say this, what we are really pushing forward is that India can actually be a developed country by 2047. So
Absolutely.
as you
And so,
say, if we continue to grow at about 7% rate of growth, India would actually what I call multiply 8 to 12 times in the next 25 years. So there is a huge potential that we're sitting on. If we just get our act together on a few things and use the 4S framework, this could really push the agenda forward.
certainly, and
Over to you, please.
for that, enabling action is required. Professor Charan Singh, coming to you, the most important aspect is that this roadmap sort of lays down the guiding principle of, in a way, setting the pathway for India to become a developed nation. The question is the key areas that have to be identified and in which we have to put renewed efforts. What, according to you, are some of the specific areas on which, we need to begin work right now for this ambition to be achieved by 2047?
Before I go further, one thing I would like to mention here is that which I think, Amit, is very, very important, and you probably have missed it, that around 2017, the Prime Minister seems to have met Professor Porter of the Harvard Business School and asked him that I want India to become a middle income country and tell me how quickly it can be, and certainly by 2047, if not earlier. Now, this is exactly what I think is very important, and this is exactly what I think I saw in the report. The urge of the leaders that the country should quickly catapult into a middle income country or a high income country. And that is what I think in the leadership itself, you need to empower the leadership, and the leadership has to empower others. In some of the things which they have mentioned, and I think they have mentioned it very well, they said they need to set up an Indian competitive observatory and they need to have executive training for leadership. I think this is the most important thing that I see in this report. From the angle of if you have the things which this report does, the first and foremost thing this report does is show you the mirror. It tells you where you are right now within the country and compared globally. They have looked at various aspects. The Professor Porter has an index which he has prepared, and that if you look at the components of that index, they are so extensive, the social progress index. It takes various components into account. So there is a mirror given to people like us in the country. Here is the mirror. Now, from this mirror, Amit mentioned the four challenges, which is correct. In the income, the inequality, the job challenge, important issue, the implementation challenge, and then the external geopolitical situation. Now, what are the key drivers? From how do we move from these challenges? I think that is where the crux and the beauty of the report is. It has to be evidence based, the drivers. There has to be a clear strategy. And then, of course, the one which I mentioned, the leadership and empowering the leadership. So, under each of this, what I think what they have done is they've looked at job creation. They have spoken about sectoral transformation, something which Amit also mentioned. They also said that India is now reasonably well integrated into the global economy. That is a plus and minus. That means the shocks will travel to us, and that also means our positivity will travel to the rest of the world. So we have to be prepared for that. And they've also mentioned that urbanization is taking place, which is very good. But then when you compare it with the rest of the world, there is a challenge there.
Absolutely. Professor
The
Singh, we'll
report
come to
has
the
spoken
challenges bit, of
about the
course. So there are opportunities that exist, but with them also come, huge challenges about which it was discussed in the presentation today as well, while the roadmap at 100 was being unveiled by the EACPM. And Dr. Kapoor will shed more light on how these were worked upon, the kind of recommendations that have been made to, in a way, address these challenges. But let me bring in Ms. Rajani Sinha here and get in her word on how, now that we have a roadmap, the next big task is to translate it into action. How do we do that? What are the specific areas? Professor Singh has spoken about some, but to propel our growth, not just in terms of economic growth, but it has to be integrated, because so for that, social progress is immensely important. So an integration of economic and social progress, taking that forward, how do we translate the guiding principles in this roadmap to actually enabling action on the ground?
I agree that's the most pertinent question at this point in time. And I would like to say that what I really liked about the report is that it emphasizes and focuses on quality of growth. So it's not just talking about achieving 7 to 8% growth consistently, but the important aspect is how are we achieving that growth? How equitable is that growth? And that is something very critical going forward, because we are all aware that India has this huge demographic advantage, and it is there for few years down the line we have that advantage. So the critical aspect would be as to how do we utilize that advantage. So in that sense, if you ask me, I would say the most critical aspect would be as to how does the government spend on human capital, which would be education, healthcare, skilling, so that we are actually able to benefit from this demographic advantage that we have. We are able to benefit from this huge labor pool that we have, and we are able to deliver quality growth. Because one challenge for Indian economy is this very high inequality that we have. So even while we want to achieve high growth, we want to do it in an equitable way so that all segments of the society benefits, so that it's a more sustainable growth. So I think this social aspect, which has been highlighted in the report, will be a critical parameter, and it will be important to see as to how that is implemented. And here I would highlight that government needs to increase its expenditure on social sectors, specifically on human capital, which would be education and healthcare.
Certainly. So very important parameters which have also been discussed, Dr. Kapoor, in the Roadmap at 100 report. And this is something I was watching the presentation and I heard Dr. Christian Kettles also speak about the fact that even though India has tremendous opportunities, it gets difficult to, translate those opportunities into some kind of positive outcome. And that is perhaps the most difficult task. In terms of that, he spoke about how it's important to generate more and more jobs, looking at the kind of labor force that is entering our markets every year. So on that aspect, what is the kind of recommendation that the report makes? What is the kind of work that is required to reap maximum potential out of this huge advantage of demographic dividend that India has?
So, your question is so important in terms of understanding what the trajectory should be. So India, what we are really saying in the report is that there is a dual challenge of development. Like one is, of course, what you call as economic development and the social development or social progress. So how do we really move forward into that direction, wherein both of them go hand in hand? So at least to begin with, the first thing we are saying is that there are key things or 5 key things that we need to actually work on. One of them is that we should actually focus on childhood poverty. How do we really improve our outcomes on childhood poverty that exist? And that means that how can we actually remove the burden of what I call childhood poverty on people, because that can actually have a huge repercussion over a period of time. The second thing is that we need to improve our education system and focus on our first 12 years of education system, because there is a very clear evidence that people who get educated, they actually have a huge multiplier on economic development and their yearly incomes. The next is the healthcare system. We have a great healthcare system, and that is actually getting reflected within the way India has actually focused on the COVID crisis and really resolved it, at least from the vaccination point of view and production point of view. but we need to strengthen our value or healthcare system. And can we create a value-based healthcare system out here? The next is about public safety and childcare. So if you really are able to focus on these things, rest is going to be about from an economic development perspective. So what are the areas that we should actually look at? In fact, very clearly, there are 3 or 4 big areas wherein we can actually create a huge multiplier. One of them is going to be very clearly healthcare. If I create a healthcare system, there is a huge multiplier, which is actually possible through this whole idea of healthcare. In fact, we can actually create a situation wherein we train our people within healthcare and we move on to really creating a multiplier. The second thing is going to be about, say, something like the tourism sector that we can focus on. Electronics is another sector that we should look at. So there are clear-cut aspects that we can actually focus on and move forward. Having said that, I think it is going to be exceedingly critical for us to really see that how states implement it. So now when we are actually saying that there is this 4S principle that needs to be looked at, the states will have to say, okay, now this makes sense. Let's try to understand how this can actually fit into various states, various cities, various industries, various ministries, and really move forward. And the other thing is the implementation challenge. We need to reduce that implementation challenge that happens. In fact, a lot of times what we do see is that India does have huge potential. They allocate budgets, but we are not able to spend those budgets at points in time. Not because the government does not have money, but because we actually have a certain implementation deficit. So we get that structure right, and we would actually be able to move forward.
Certainly, I think, Professor Singh, that's a very important point. So each of the economists, whenever they talk about the challenges, and they tend to highlight that it's not that reforms are not taking place in the country and that there are not enough right policies. They are. There have been enough policies to bring about the kind of transformation that we keep talking about. I think the area where we are lagging behind is effective implementation. And that is something that we have to focus on if we want to translate this aim into some kind of action, and if we want to see the positive outcome. So how do you think that restructuring has to take place, the transformation in the way we now, look at how policies are implemented on the ground?
So if you ask me on that, like one is going to be in terms of how do we strengthen our federalism that actually exists. In fact, the Prime Minister has said competitive federalism. So is it not possible that we actually move forward into that direction even deeper? We need to actually move beyond, say, a simple calculation at the state level and say that let's talk about the key things, that this is what we have done, this is where we have moved forward, and look at all aspects across the board, social aspects, economic development aspects, and move into that direction, improve institutional capacity. And then, of course, there has to be a dialogue between people. But there's something very important, and which the report does highlight as well in a certain way, and that is, and what the Prime Minister has also said in his August 15th speech, that we need to focus on R&D. So if we are able to focus on that, that is where you will see the emergence of new business models, new ideas, and that development will happen. Eventually, at the end of the day, if we want India to be successful, we will have to have successful firms, because productivity or increase in wealth, increase in value creation is going to happen when entrepreneurship flourishes. So how do we really move forward in terms of creating more enterprises? We are seeing some evidence of creation of unicorns, but at the end of the day, it is going to be about creating more enterprises. And we need to focus on that. We need to move from being a nation which just gets the job-seeking ideology to a job creation idea. And that is what we need to actually move toward.
Professor Singh, that's an important point that Dr. Kapoor just made about R&D and encouraging that R&D culture in our country, because quality R&D is the key to India's future. This is something that has been, time and again been reiterated by Prime Minister Modi himself. Help us understand the kind of challenges that that we face in encouraging research and development in our country. Is it just investment, or the kind of challenges we face in terms of technology? What is it, and how can we ensure that India emerges as the global hub for R&D if we are to grow and make a name, particularly in this sector?
One thing is very clear, and the Prime Minister mentioned it right from the ramparts of the Red Fort, and I totally agree with it. But then in the report, very clearly mentioned that you need to, in the implementation, that was your question, on the implementation, the jobs and the firms, they have to be competitive. And that is the report also mentioning about MSMEs. And that is why I say, where is the maximum lack of R&D? The maximum lack of R&D is in MSMEs. 6,000 products they produce. There are 6 crore of them employing 12 crore people. There is no R&D in MSMEs. That is why repeatedly I have been now writing and arguing, like we did agriculture universities in 70s, we need to do now entrepreneur universities or MSME universities now to take care of the 130 million youth which will enter the workforce in the next 1 decade. I think that is where we need to strengthen our R&D. The other thing I would also like to mention, and again related to the question, if you look at the labor productivity, is still lower than China. And in the labor force, 70% in 1990, and we are 56% now. And investment is again lower than China. It was, I think, around 70%, 90% earlier. It's 55% now compared to China. So therefore, I say that it's extremely important that our investment, our labor productivity has to be focused upon, and the MSME sector, because that is going to be the driver of the economy. That's what is going to be providing jobs for next decade, and the numbers are huge, huge. We are adding nearly 1 crore people in the workforce every year for the next 10 years. Those jobs have to be created. If you give me a minute, I want to mention two more things. The report has very beautifully at the fag end of the report mentioned that the dialogue has to start. And why I say it is so important, because if we have to be a middle income country where our per capita income has to grow and our overall economy has to grow to nearly $20 trillion, 2.5x soon, and $7 trillion if we have to attain the middle income growth, what we need to do is start thinking in those lines. And that is one point which the report has mentioned, and I think it is well mentioned, that in India, we have 52 ministries and 57 departments. And when Mr. Amit was speaking about the government interaction and the need to strengthen the government and the system within the government, the report mentions that USA has only 15 federal departments. And then they argue in the report why they are mentioning about the large size of the ministries and large size of the departments. The important thing is the coordination within the governments, both at the national level, at the state level, and the report also mentions at the local body, Panchayati Raj 74th Amendment level. So once that happens, then as I look at it, the investment that will be dedicated to productivity and to R&D can be taken into account together as to where is it needed. Like in agriculture, we knew where we needed R&D. We needed it in wheat, we needed it in rice, and we did it. Then we needed it in fertilizers, we did it. That is exactly how I think once there is coordinated activity within the governments and the government departments are talking to each other, we'll be able to laser beam our expenditure on R&D. Right now, most of the R&D in the country is taking place in defense. That has to be now percolating down into industry. Some industries have an R&D unit, some pharma companies have an R&D unit, but the point I'm trying to make right from the beginning is we need MSME sector. There is no R&D in MSME.
Absolutely. Let me bring in Ms. Rajani Sinha into that important aspect. Rajani Sinha, across the world, in several of the developed countries, we are seeing it's the private players that are propelling R&D. In India, it's the reverse. So the enhanced role of the private sector when it comes to encouraging innovation. And the other aspect of how to increase coordination among the various stakeholders. So is there a need to redesign sort of a new architecture that can build coordination among the various stakeholders that are involved? What do you reckon?
So, like you mentioned, the private sector in India has been lagging when it comes to R&D. So even the big corporates, the percentage share that they are spending on R&D is quite dismal, and we would have liked that number to be higher. So like Professor Singh highlighted, while we are talking about and concerned about the lack of R&D in the MSME segment, in fact, we do not have enough R&D expenditure happening even by the big corporates who have the financial muscle and strength to do this kind of expenditure. So I think for that, it's important to encourage this whole culture of competitiveness and innovation so that the private players do not get complacent and they think of newer ways in which innovation and R&D can result in their revenues increasing. So there is need for the private players to realize the need for R&D and increase the expenditure on R&D, which is not happening currently, I would say. And yeah, I completely agree that MSMEs going forward are going to play a very critical role. In fact, even now, if we see the unorganized sector and MSME sector in India plays a very big role. They are the ones who absorb a large percentage of our workforce, because we have to understand that in India, we have a large workforce which is unskilled, and they are able to get absorbed mainly in the MSME segment and in the unorganized sector. So it would be very critical if this particular segment also starts innovating and spending in R&D. But yes, that is to be a challenging task.
Absolutely. So some of these challenges that exist and for which, some recommendations have been made in the Roadmap at 100 report that has been prepared by the Institute for Competitiveness. Dr. Kapoor, I would like you to close the show for us. In the wake of these domestic challenges, as well as the global headwinds that continue to impact our economy as well, we obviously continue to feel the heat of what's happening in the US, what's happening as an aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, as a result of food insecurity. It does impact us. We feel the heat. So the question is that despite these challenges, India has to maintain that sustained growth if we want to achieve this target of becoming a developed nation, to achieve that status of 2047. How are we going to balance that between domestic as well as the global challenges?
So, the question is, again, it's a double-edged sword, as you might actually want to say. And for me, I think behind every challenge, there is an opportunity to really make a difference. So when you talk about, say, climate change, there is a huge possibility to really work on climate change, create positivity around it, or create newer business models. India has moved towards renewable energy, or it is clearly moving towards that. It is moving towards electric vehicles. So that means there is a clear-cut focus in terms of understanding the crisis and creating an opportunity around it. When you talk about the geopolitical challenges that have happened, especially the whole crisis because of the Russia-Ukraine war, the COVID crisis, but now we know that there is going to be a rebalancing of the global value chains. So if we are able to rebalance, and if India is able to take some bits of it, that is where the thing is going to move on. But one of the most important things, and where India has shown that it can actually create huge positives, is the digitization that we have actually done in the last few years. There is a whole huge thing, especially the UPI, as to how we have really panned out, how we are actually moved from the to bank for the unbankable. We have
Absolutely.
moved into that direction.
I think the most important takeaway here, Dr. Kapoor, is that opportunities in India far outweigh the challenges that we face, both domestically as well as globally. And perhaps that is going to be an important factor that will write our growth story and propel us towards the status of a developed nation, as the Prime Minister has, set this ambitious target, and all of us hope to achieve in the next 25 years or so. So that having been said, time is running short. I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you very much to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective today and sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have all three of you on this edition of The Perspective. And thank you to you viewers as well for your time. I'll see you same time tomorrow now with another topic and a different set of panelists. Until then, you take care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.